All right. Well, last time on the program, we started to look at Revelation chapter 17, where we're getting some information, starting to get some information about the prostitute and the beast on whom she rides. And I got to tell you, probably this entire chapter is somewhat of a challenging passage. A lot of people have had some troubles with it, and I'm not going to be one that says that I have everything figured out. Although I do think that I'm pretty close to understanding. I think maybe what John is trying to communicate here as it relates to the prostitute and to the beast. And we talked about the prostitute last time, and got a little bit of information and insight on her, who she is, and from a symbolic sense. We're not talking about somebody who is an individual. That's not what John is trying to convey here. But we talked about who the prostitute is and what she's up to. What kind of things is she doing? And we took the first 7 verses of chapter 17 to look at that. Now we're going to get a little bit more information on the beast. Now, if you've been with us throughout this study, and even particularly when we were looking at Revelation chapter 13, you were with us when we talked about the beast somewhat at length, because that's where you see the beast emerging from the sea and everything like that. And we saw that the description of the beast is that it had 7 heads and 10 horns. And we didn't go into the whole thing of 7 heads and 10 horns. And the reason was because I said is that chapter 17 is going to describe that for the most part, and so we'll just wait until we get to that part of that chapter to talk about that. Well, we have arrived. We've arrived at that point. So what is the whole thing with the beast now? And what is that going to have? What is the beast going to have to do with the prostitute? We'll actually talk more about that next time. But for right now, the focus is shifted to the beast on whom the prostitute rides. And we have a description and an explanation of what the 7 heads and the 10 horns are. Now, believe it or not, even though we're at a section where we're giving something symbolically, but then we're given some help as to what they represent. Even with that being the case, there's still some disagreement and there's still some speculation onto some of the meanings behind some of these things. So even though there's some help, there's still a little bit of mystery, at least on our end, in how we should understand this. So we're going to do our best here to explain this as best way that we can, to come to a full understanding of what's being talked about here, and then see where that takes us. Okay, so some interesting things I think that we have in store for us, just as we explore more of the beast. Okay, so I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, so I think the plan is for this time, and this is it's interesting. A few weeks ago, I foresaw us maybe splitting chapter 17 of Revelation into covering it in 2 episodes. So what we covered last time, and then the rest of the chapter this time, and then as time went on, I kind of thought, okay, maybe this is going to be a 3-parter as it relates to that, and so. That's kind of what I've stuck with, that latter approach. So we're still going to be in chapter 17 next time, but we should finish up. And the reason why I'm taking an extra week is because there's so much in this particular setup that we're going to look at here in verses 8 through 14. The challenge is to not seem rushed if the goal is to finish up the chapter. Okay. I want to make sure that we're on the same page with everything, that we come to an understanding of what John is trying to communicate. And it's going to take a little bit of explanation. Okay. And it's not anything that I feel like I can just breeze through, just kind of, whoop, there we go. And that's what you have. Now, I don't think it's going to require a whole bunch of discussion where we get deep into the weeds. And so we get lost in everything. But I think it's just going to be best for our purposes just to take 2 more episodes, this episode and then the next episode, to cover this, so that we have a sufficient amount of time, specifically and especially to cover verses 8 through 14. So that's the plan going into this. Now, before we get into the particulars here, I think you know what time it is by now. It's time for the shameless plug for my book, Signs of the End: What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It, by me, Steve Gill. You can get it on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, a book that is about Jesus' words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 13. I hope that it's insightful to its readers, and I'll just say that from some of the feedback that I've gotten from some people who've read it, they've told me that it's been helpful and it's brought clarity to certain things and certain questions that they've had. So that's an encouragement to me, and I'm so glad and I'm so grateful that my book has been able to serve them in that way and kind of provide some of the questions that they might have and give them some clarity and that sort of thing. And so if you're in the same spot, just as it relates to the sermon on, not the Sermon on the Mount, excuse me, the Olivet Discourse, and what some things mean here, or what was Jesus trying to get at here or there and that sort of thing, this book might fit your needs in answering some of those questions. So I'd encourage you to get that book. Again, Signs of the End: What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It? Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. And as usual, I will leave a link to the Amazon page in the description of this episode. So if you can click on it, you can go right to that page and order yourself a copy. I would strongly encourage you to do so. Okay, so let me do what I did last time, and that is read the entire chapter of chapter 17 again, so we can have a full understanding and a full picture of what we're dealing with here. So chapter 17, starting in verse 1, it says, Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an eighth. It is an eighth, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. They are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And the angel said to me, The waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Okay, so that's all of chapter 17. Now, if you were with us last time, some of that sounded familiar because we went over it in detail. That was specifically verses 1 through 7 of that chapter. And I don't want to spend a great deal of time in review of all that. I think what's noteworthy, most noteworthy, the things that we can repeat again, just as it relates to things that we talked about last time, is the fact that with this prostitute and her symbolic manifestation, as seen here in chapter 17, is supposed to give us an understanding that this was a woman who was very beautiful in appearance and was decked out. And luxury is the name of her game here. And it's supposed to, and it was used to draw people in, specifically the kings of the earth, as it says, that went into her, right? Which gives us an understanding of the riches and the luxury and that sort of thing. And also the dwellers of the earth as well. Okay. But not only that, but as we saw near the end of that, at the end of that passage, and what we talked about last time, is that she was drunk on the blood of the saints. And we talked about how the martyrdom of the saints, as it relates to the prostitute, how the luxury, materialism, and that sort of thing is connected to persecution and martyrdom, in the simple fact that the prostitute is riding the beast. And we've seen the beast before. We've seen him emerge from the sea in chapter 13. We've seen that he's waged war against the saints that have conquered them. So there's been persecution against God's people. But as it relates to the whole thing of riches and materialism and that sort of thing, basically, what you see here is the allure, trying to draw the saints away from the one true God and into the whole thing of riches and materialism without God. And in some ways, those things might be connected to other religious systems, very much connected to the beast and everything like that. Now, again, one thing that I'll mention here that I mentioned last time is that this whole passage isn't to say that materials and things, certain things, riches and having things is in and of itself is bad. But if you have the draw and the allure of getting those things and abandoning the things having to do with God, the things of God, Jesus Christ, and everything like that, that's where the problem is. And that's what the prostitute who's riding the beast is trying to draw, as it relates to the saints and drawing them away from God and the one true God. Now, when the faithful saints refuse to do so, and not only do they refuse to do so, but they hold fast to the testimony of Jesus Christ and continue to proclaim his name, that's when you have the persecution in the form of martyrdom, which you see at the hands of the beast. So you see how those things are very much connected and tied together. Okay, but the one thing that we left things at last time, as it relates to the prostitute, was the fact that John was totally marveling at her, which, if you remember what I said last time, I think that's kind of amazing because, again, the prostitute is riding the beast and John is just focused and fixed on the woman, on the prostitute, and marveled greatly. He was greatly amazed. I mean, it's almost as if he was overlooking the beast that she was riding. I'm not saying that John didn't see the beast, but it's just kind of like the lure and the beauty of the prostitute was to such a degree that he's able to fix his eyes on her and be amazed at her luxury and her riches and her materialism and everything like that. And you kind of think, are you forgetting the fact that she's riding the beast who's responsible for shedding the blood of the saints and all those sorts of things. But we talked about how that kind of, John isn't in a camp by himself. I mean, that's something that all Christians have to be careful of as it relates to the pull and lure of riches and materialism and that sort of thing. And that the message that's given to John and what's going to be illustrated here in the verses to follow is that things are not as they seem to be. The beauty that you see right now that might be used to lure people away, like John and everybody else, is not something that you should cling to, because we see, as things are explained to us, is that the prostitute is going to go down for the count, okay, by the beast himself, by the way. So, why would we want to ride that train? Okay. So that's pretty much what we're dealing with there. And that's why the angel that was with John says, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her." So it's like, listen, I'm going to show you what the real deal is. Things as it relates to this prostitute, she's beautiful. She has this allure to her, but not everything is what it seems to be. And you're not going to want to hitch yourself to this train here. Okay. And so in starting out and explaining things, it's interesting that the angel now switches things and starts describing the beast, the things having to do with the beast. And like I said, it's kind of interesting that John kind of seems to overlook the beast. And so in the angel's explanation to John as to how things are not as they seem to be, it's almost as if he's drawing his attention to the beast and saying, "Hey, remember the beast here? Remember the beast? We've run across the beast before, and remember, this is the beast that the prostitute is riding." So, and that's that there's a meaning behind that, and we've talked about that whole thing, and so that's mainly what we're going to be looking at in verses 8 through 14 is this description of the beast. And we're going to see, you can pretty much divide this up in 3 areas here. Number 1, a description of the beast overall, just an overall, just kind of perspective on the beast and what is going to happen to him. And then number 2, the description of what the 7 heads are. And then number 3, what the 10 horns are. Okay. So we're going to get into all of that and see what the angel has to say to John related to all of those things. Okay. So that's where we pick up here. So when we get into verse 8 here, picking up where we left off, this is where it says, "The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction." Now, right away, I think this is very interesting. I mean, just notice the designation that's given here to the beast. It says, "This is the beast that you saw was," and you would think, because here's the thing, you think that the beast, one of the things that the beast does is parodies the Messiah. But, you would think that if this is kind of what's going on here, that the description of the beast is like the beast that you saw was and is about to rise from the bottomless pit. But that's really not what we have here. Okay. Notice the beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit to go to destruction. So that last part there, that's the destination that we're going towards here, the destruction of the beast. The beast is going to be destroyed. Now, remember how we've described the beast in the past. The beast, as I've said before, is not a single particular end times individual during a 7-year tribulation period. Remember the descriptions of the beast that we saw in chapter 13 gives us this idea that we're dealing with a conglomeration of nations that have historically set themselves up against the people of God. And that's really the idea that you're supposed to get. So that in history, throughout history, church's history, between the first and second comings of Christ, what you have are different manifestations of the beast that come against God's people. And in the first century context, one manifestation of that, and we talked about that as it related to the mark of the beast, one of those manifestations in the first century would have been someone like Nero. Okay. So that's what we're dealing with there, just as far as that. So if we're talking about something historically here, okay, as it relates to the beast, and we're not talking about an individual, we see how there's, the fact that the beast was, so we've seen different manifestations of the beast in the past. Okay. I would even say that it doesn't necessarily even have to be limited to between the first and second comings of Christ. Again, if this is drawn from descriptions that are drawn from the Old Testament, I think it would be safe to say that even the nations that are described in the Old Testament that go against God's people can be, in a certain sense, seen as manifestations of the beast even before Christ comes on the scene, right? So in human history, we know that the beast was. He has existed. But now notice here where it says that he is not. You would expect for it to say that he is, but it doesn't. It says that he is not. And there's a good reason and an explanation as to why that is. And in fact, let me let you in on a clue as to what it means for the beast to be one who is not. Okay. When it says that the beast is not, it's not saying that the beast is no longer in existence or that there's no longer any manifestation of the beast in human history until it comes to the second coming of Christ. That's not what we're dealing with here. But I'll tell you what we're dealing with here. And the big clue that you have of that here is in that last part there where it says, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit. Okay. Now that's interesting because when we saw the introduction of the beast in chapter 13, he was arising out of the sea. Okay. Here in chapter 17, he's going to arise from the bottomless pit. Okay. Which again gives you this idea that we're dealing with something very spiritual here. Now, I have to be cautious here because there's a certain element of what goes into this here that we're going to talk about in later chapters. There's kind of been a debate in my mind as to how much detail do I go into things here and reserve those for when we get to certain passages in the future and so forth and so on. I'm going to try the best way that I can to kind of introduce a concept here and, in a way that hopefully gives us a little bit of an understanding of what John is seeing and what's being conveyed here. While at the same time leaving the details of the discussion for later when we get to that particular point. If you're familiar with the bottomless pit, we've seen the bottomless pit before, particularly in places like chapter 9. In the midst of the trumpet judgments, that's where those demon creatures came out, at the sounding of one of the trumpets. But probably in a more familiar sense, when we think about the bottomless pit, we think about the dragon. Why? Because when you go to the well-known chapter in Revelation chapter 20, which would be Revelation chapter 20, we read this whole thing about Satan being bound and being thrown into the abyss. Some translations say the abyss, others say the bottomless pit, or just the pit. If you were to look at Revelation chapter 20, it says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit." Okay, there you go. "And a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Okay, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while." And you know that when he's released, where is he released from? He's released from where he had been, again, I believe symbolically here, locked away, which is the abyss. So here we see that was having to do with the dragon in chapter 20. Here in chapter 17, we're talking about the beast, and it's saying that the beast is going to arise out of the bottomless pit and go to his destruction, very much in the same way that the dragon is going to. Okay, which that sort of thing can't be overlooked. I think it shows us the connection between the two, and the spiritual implications, the spiritual connections between the two as it relates to the evil spiritual realm, right? And we've seen that before in chapters 12 and chapter 13, right? So basically, we have to ask the question, okay, so what is Satan? What is the whole thing with the Satan, the dragon, being locked into the bottomless pit? What does that represent? Now, here's where the difficulty comes in, because I'm going to lay something out here, not give as much detail on it, because we're going to talk about it when we get to chapter 20. And the last thing I want to do is to leave you hanging in certain areas and that sort of thing, and leaving you in suspense. Okay. But basically, what you have here is, first of all, it's not a literal binding of Satan. Satan is a spiritual being. You can't bind a spiritual being with a physical chain. So again, what we're looking at there is something that's symbolic there. But as I intend to show you when we get there and we talk about this in a little bit more detail, the binding of the dragon has to do with the effects of what Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection and ascension have on the dragon as it relates to the current kingdom that is now, okay, and the rulership of Christ that is now, and the preaching of the gospel that is now, okay? And so with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, Satan is bound for a particular purpose. Now here, I'm going to lay this out also as well. We'll talk more in detail more about it when we get there. But if you read further on in chapter 20, the reason why Satan is bound is so that he does not deceive the nations any longer. Now, when he's released from the bottomless pit, what does he do? He deceives the nations to do what? To gather for that great war against the Lord and against his saints, at which time they're going to be swiftly defeated. Okay, so that's what binding means. Okay, as it relates to the dragon. And so that's, and so in the same way, I think that you have the same thing with the beast here. And this also should tell us something pretty interesting and significant for anybody who insists that the beast is the end times Antichrist during a 7-year tribulation period. Because if that's the case, then what's he doing in the bottomless pit? He's in there because he's going to arise from there at some point. So, what is that all about? It doesn't seem to be congruent or, inconsistency with what a lot of premillennial people believe as it relates to all of that. Okay, so with the beast, being somebody who's in the bottomless pit or in the abyss, and he's going to be released to go to his destruction, just as the dragon is going to be, just as the nations are going to be when the dragon deceives them to gather them for a matchup of Armageddon, so to speak, right? The same thing is going to be true for the beast, okay? And so that should give us a little bit of an understanding of what it means for the beast to be something that is not. It is not in the sense that it is not able to. How's the best way to put this? It's not able to keep the gospel from spreading and from covering all the earth. And actually, we've talked about this in places like chapter 14, which followed chapter 13, and we saw out there with the 144,000 that was a remnant, which gives us a clue and gives us this understanding that there's more people to come who will become a part of the people of God as a result of the preaching of the gospel. Okay, so the beast is not going to be able to stop the spread of the gospel, is not going to be able to stop conversions from happening. Now, it will continue to oppress the saints. It will continue to make war with the saints and conquer them. And again, you see that in different manifestations of the beast throughout human history, right? But the whole thing of it was, but then it is not. What it's talking about there, it's as it relates to the gospel and as it relates to the subsequent consequences that you see regarding Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Okay, and then there will be a time, just like we saw with the dragon, and this whole thing that happened with the dragon, it's happening concurrently with the beast, where the beast is going to arise from the bottomless pit. And just as we're going to see in Revelation chapter 20, the destruction of God's enemies. So the case is going to be for the beast as well. And the beast specifically, we're going to see his destruction in chapter 19. Now, you might ask, okay, wait a minute. So you say we're going to read about his destruction in chapter 20, but you're saying the beast is destroyed in chapter 19. What in the world are you talking about there? Well, that goes back into the whole thing of recapitulation. If you've been with our study in the book of Revelation, you know how recapitulation works. We've been seeing different visions of the same period of time, but through different lenses and in different perspectives, different camera angles is a way that we've been describing that. Okay. And so all of that to say, I guess maybe it's just kind of wind down that explanation here. I don't want to explain too much lest that creates more confusion or anything like that than is necessary. But I believe that's how we are to understand the whole thing with the beast. When it says the beast that you saw was and is not, and again, so you should understand that the fact that it's saying it is not isn't to say that the beast isn't active. the beast is active and has been active throughout human history. Okay, but this is as it relates to the ministry of Christ through the preaching of the gospel through his saints as a result of his death, burial, resurrection, and everything like that. Again, if that sounds a little bit vague or a little bit confusing, again, I'm connecting this to things that we see in Revelation chapter 20, where a lot of people have a very strong understanding of how that should be interpreted, which I myself, and not just me, but I and a lot of other people tend to disagree with. And I think there's a different explanation that goes into Revelation chapter 20. And hopefully when we get to Revelation chapter 20, when we explain these things will become a little bit more clear. And maybe what I'll do is that as we're talking about those things, I'll draw our attention back to what we've seen here in chapter 17 in relation to the beast. And hopefully that way the light bulbs will click there. Okay. So the beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit to go to destruction. Now, still in the middle of verse 8, and the dwellers on earth, and again, that's just a general designation having to do with unbelievers. We've seen it all throughout the book of Revelation. And the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. Now, a couple of things that we've seen here that should be familiar to us that we've seen in chapter 13. Again, the whole thing of the book of life, and the fact that the dwellers of the earth are people whose names are not found in the Lamb's book of life. Okay, so again, as it says, in the dwellers of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. Okay, so the fact that their names are not written in the Lamb's book of life before the foundation of the world, again, as it says here and as we've seen in chapter 13, explains what we see as it relates to how they view the beast. Those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life and who are God's people and who are saved aren't marveling at the beast at all. And it's very interesting. And again, notice the contrast that we see here, and at least as it relates to John and everything, because John marveled greatly at the woman, at the prostitute, right? But remember, she's riding the beast, and it's the unbelievers who are marveling at the beast upon whom she rides. Now, in chapter 13, so the fact, again, remember that the fact that these people, their names are not written in the Lamb's book of life, explains the fact that how they're able to marvel at the beast. And then the term that I used before to describe this was to say that they are of kindred spirit. They kind of have the kindred spirit as it relates to things that are against God, against Christ, the things of Christ, and against his people, right? So it's very easy for them to marvel as it relates to those sorts of things. And so, and especially in chapter 13, what we saw there was that they marveled at the fact that one of the heads of the beast appeared to be wounded, but it had been healed. And that really what drew the marvel even more from the people of the earth. Here we kind of have a little bit more of an expanded view on that, where the focus isn't so much on an injured head that's been healed. But again, I think this is the marveling that we see as it relates to the dwellers of the earth toward the beast has to do with this, let's call it the ultimate climax, so to speak, in this whole drama in human history. Because if we're talking about a beast who is to come, we're not talking about just a healing of a head that belongs to the beast. We're talking about the beast all in his totality, who's going to come up from the bottomless pit, who's going to be released, so to speak, if we want to use the same language that we see in Revelation chapter 20. And in this grand ultimate climax, and as there's this gathering for this battle of Armageddon, that all the nations of the earth are going to gather against the Lord and against his people, there you see where that marveling is, because it's almost as if, it's the return of the beast with a vengeance, sort of thing. And so it all comes to a head, and, we're going to see different camera angles as it relates to this. But I think in this vision here in chapter 17, that's where the marveling is most focused. In chapter 13, it had to do with the healing of the head that had been previously been wounded. Here in chapter 17, it's on a much grander scale. Okay, because you know that they're dealing with a beast that was and is not and is to come. And I think the whole emphasis is on that whole thing of it being one who is to come. And the one that is to come, remember, it's going to be a magnificent return, here, as it relates to all of that. By the way, one thing a difference that we see here between the beast and between the Lamb, Jesus Christ, is that in that third part there, the beast who is to come is coming to destruction. The Lamb who is to come comes in victory, and he's going to defeat the beast. So, I mean, this isn't even going to be anything as far as that goes that's going to be of comparison there. But so there you have the people whose names have not been written in the Lamb's Book of Life, who are marveling at the beast because of this grander, return with a vengeance, let's call it, because of the ultimate climax here. And so let's see here in verse 9, it says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. And here's where we get to the description of the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And it starts with the 7 heads. It says the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, and the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. Okay, so there's the description of the 7 heads. So, as I said, we reserve the discussion of what the 7 heads and the 10 horns mean and everything like that for this time. Well, here we are, and there's the description of it. Like I said, John helps us out in describing this and saying this is what it means. This is what the 7 heads mean. This is what the 10 horns mean. So when we're talking about 7 heads representing 7 hills, a lot of people say, that is Rome, right? And, the first century audience would have understood it to be Rome, so forth and so on, and that sort of thing. And that's not too far off the mark. It's not the only thing, though. I think we're dealing with a situation of things that we've seen before, particularly, for example, we're talking about the great city or Babylon the Great. That's supposed to call to mind things having to do with Rome, but it's more than Rome, okay? It's more than that. Now, here's the thing. Depending on where you fall eschatologically in your beliefs and that sort of thing, you have different conclusions as to what's being talked about here. A lot of people who are futurist in their beliefs, again, who are seeing the beast and the 7 hills and everything like that, a lot of times they, actually, maybe somewhat with the 7 heads, but maybe more so even with the 10 horns. It's like the talk is, a revived Roman Empire. Since Rome has fallen, Rome fell, and, the empire anyway. If we're looking at this from a futurist lens, a lot of the focus is on a revived Roman Empire. Now, if you're looking at this from a preterist perspective, we're looking at this and saying, look, this is all talking about things from John's day. Okay. And so, and especially with the 7 heads, representing 7 hills. Okay, that's Rome, and we're talking about Rome of the first century and everything like that. And if we're also talking about it being 7 kings, now we get into this whole thing, and this is where some of the confusion comes in, because then they'll say, okay, if this is something in John's day, then we can determine who the 7 kings are that he's talking about here. So if we're looking at John in his present day, we know that one of the kings is one right now. So 5 have fallen, one is, that would be the current one from the first century context. And then there's another one to come. So we can figure out who that other emperor is that's going to be. Now, the confusion gets a little bit deeper, in that, you also have to take into account when you believe the book of Revelation was written. So if you're one who thinks that this was written before 70 AD, then your belief on who may be the current emperor at that time will be different from those people who say that the book of Revelation was written at a later date, i.e., the mid-90s. Okay, so you see where all this confusion and stuff comes in, and everything. And so, because of those views, you have people who approach, trying to identify who these kings are historically in different ways. I mean, and you have a list of them, going back to 101 BC and going all the way to Nerva. You have Julius Caesar, then you have Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, and Nerva. Okay. So the question is, okay, where do you begin? And then start counting from there to get to the one where John is currently writing at that point and saying that's the one that is right now. And then the one after that one is the one to come. Now, listen, we can go into the specifics on who starts where and everything like that. And listen, that might be interesting to some people. And in some sense, maybe to a certain degree, that might be worthwhile. But for our purposes, we're not going to get into too much into the weeds with that. Suffice it to say that people have different approaches as it comes to that. And listen, one of the things that's noteworthy is that, in order for some of this to fit historically, and if you count, certain emperors starting with this one here and counting, and if it doesn't work out the way that some people expect it to as far as which emperor it lands on, then you have some people who say, well, maybe we can eliminate this one and this one because this emperor didn't rule for very long, so maybe we can eliminate these and these and these. And there were some emperors that had very short tenures. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, those are three successive ones that really didn't rule for very long. And so some people in their analysis saying, okay, well, you can discount those people because they didn't rule for very long, and so maybe you don't need to count those. And once you do that, then things work out in your favor as far as who you think the emperor should be and that sort of thing, which I don't think is a legitimate way to approach that, because no matter how long they ruled, they are recognized historically as a legitimate emperor in the Roman Empire. Okay. And so, I mean, that's just the same way as we look at things here. I mean, William Henry Harrison is numbered as the 9th president of the United States. Now, he only was in office for 3 months after his inauguration, and then he died. We don't bypass him and say, oh, he wasn't really a president. No, we still count him as the president of the United States. He was the 9th president of the United States, even though he served the shortest term as president in American history. Okay. So I don't think it's really correct to kind of shuffle things around to kind of make things fit by saying, I see the problem is, we can discount these emperors here because they didn't rule for very long. Well, what does that have to do with anything? They were still emperors, right? They were still, and people historically, they've been recognized as emperors. So you see kind of the difficulty that kind of arises with things as it relates to that. I'm one who kind of takes more of a symbolic approach. Now, I think that Seven Hills does bring about things having to do with Rome. It brings to mind things having to do with Rome. And I think that's why they're called Seven Hills. Notice they're called Seven Hills, and they're also called Seven Kings. So I think the fact that we're talking about Seven Hills is supposed to bring about this understanding of we're talking about Rome. But again, I think we're supposed to understand this as something that goes beyond Rome, just as we've seen with Babylon the Great and also with the great city. Okay. So with that being said, then I want to draw your attention back to what it says at the beginning of verse 9, which I think is in favor of what I think of this as far as looking at this more symbolically rather than historically. Because it says this calls for a mind with wisdom. Remember, we saw something similar to this in chapter 13 as it related to the mark of the beast. And the mind of wisdom that's called for was something where, you kind of have to go beneath the surface to draw out the meaning of what's being laid out there. In chapter 13, it was through the whole system of gematria to calculate the number of the beast, which is the beast of a man, right? We went over all of that when we went through chapter 13, and specifically that section here. Here we're given the same call, although we're not dealing with gematria or anything here in chapter 17, but I do believe that we are dealing with something symbolically here. So this calls for a mind with wisdom, which I don't think that's a call for that is really necessary if you're simply dealing with, historical kings where you could just say, oh, okay, well, yeah, this king, this king, this king, this king, this king, this one is current in John's day, and then the next one after that. I mean, then it just doesn't seem like that's something that's called for wisdom or anything like that. I think the call for wisdom fits better with a symbolic approach to this. And the symbolic approach to something like this isn't new, especially when it comes to numbers. And numbers, that we're dealing with, especially the number 7. The number 7, we've dealt with that multiple times in the book of Revelation, and we've always said that the number 7 is a number of completeness or perfection. So the fact that we're dealing with Rome, that we're dealing with seven kings, brings about a completeness, and we're talking about complete royal authority or power, or governmental power or authority. Which again, I think this plays into, what we've talked about before related to the beast. The beast is more along the lines of governmental power, political power, that sort of thing. You see that here in chapter 17 with the 7 kings. Okay. And so basically, here's what I think about 5 fallen kings, and then one that is, and then one that comes up after this. I think no matter what time in history that you live in, whatever time in history that you're living in, you're always on the 6th king. Because if we're not looking at things historically, where we're trying to pin actual historical king names to these different kings, to these different heads, and we're looking at it more from a symbolic view, where it's just talking about completeness, I think we're more in line with talking about the manifestation of the complete authority and power of the beast from between the first and second comings of Christ. And remember, when we've looked at the beast in chapter 13, he says he was given authority over every tribe, tongue, people, language, and nation, and that sort of thing. Okay, so we see that, and when we see that through the lens of it being this from the state, from the government. I think that that's the best way that we can really understand something like this. Okay, so it's through the state that you have this, and in whatever current place, whether in John's day when he's writing this the 1st century, or even if you're talking about the 21st century in our day, or if we're looking at this through the lens of completion, spanning throughout history between the first and second comings of Christ, you're always presently going to be on the sixth head, or the 6th king, or the 6th hill, however you want to describe it. You're always going to have 5 that are past, because we're looking at this through a span of time, and that's what symbolically what this is supposed to denote here: political power and authority that stretches throughout history. Complete, full power, again, and we've talked about that in chapter 13, that was given to the beast and is exercised, okay? And so the next king, so to speak, quote unquote, again, we're not talking about a specific king or a specific name that we're supposed to draw from history, is going to be that end time sort of manifestation of things when things come to a head when Christ comes back. And that's what we're supposed to see there. And you see that especially, let me see here. Let's see, verse 10, they are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. Now listen, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. Now, take that whole thing of, he's going to be just for a little while, and let's draw our minds back to, or actually forward, not back, forward to chapter 20. Now, again, I'm going to make a connection here, from what we're seeing with the beast to what we're seeing, what we see with the dragon in Revelation chapter 20. Remember what it says there. Let's see, in verse 3, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So again, you see the connection again. So we're seeing these connections here, and it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, if you've been with us in our study of the book of Revelation, and we've been seeing how this isn't a straight chronological explanation of end times things, a sequential chronological sort of thing, but we've been seeing different visions from different camera angles, but you still see similar language that explains that same event. This is what we're talking about right here. And so with that when it comes to that seventh king, what it's talking about is that one final moment as it relates to complete power, authority, exercise, having to do with the beast, but it's at that end time when that beast is rises from the bottomless pit, as does the dragon. And again, just like the dragon, he'll be released for a little while. So here in verse 10, it says he must remain only a little while. Okay. Now, granted, when you get into verse 11 here, it is a little bit confusing, and this has confused a lot of people. And I can't say that I have total 100%, understanding of this as well. But I mean, I have guesses. But in verse 11, it says, "And for the beast that was and is not, it is an eighth, but it belongs to the seven, and it goes to destruction." So there again, there's the second time where it talks about the beast itself going to destruction. Now, it's strange that as part of the beast, the makeup of this beast and the description of the beast, it's described as having seven heads, which are seven kings, but that the beast itself, all in himself, he is an eighth king. Okay. Which is as it's saying here, it's not disconnected from the seven. It's very much part of the seven, and it goes to destruction. And I think the short-lived arising of the beast as the eighth king is somewhat in view here. And some people have suggested that this is what I've heard most of, and this might very well be the possibility here, is that the beast being the eighth king, might signal that even beyond the seven, which is a number of completeness, the introduction of the beast as an eighth king is supposed to represent some sort of an excess, which, if we're talking about things at the end of the age, a gathering of the nations of the earth, the kings of the earth, to go against the people of God. I mean, if you really read the prophecies as it relates to that, you see that this is going to be, like I said, the ultimate climax here. And so the fact that the eighth king is added on to this, that being the beast itself, is supposed to portray something like that. Maybe that is the case. Not 100% sure of that, but I don't discount it as a possibility. But there we see that, in verse 11, as for the beast that was and is not, and notice it doesn't say it is to come after that. It just says, but it says, as for the beast that was and is not, it is an eighth. It is an eighth, but it belongs to the it belongs to the seven. Okay. And then it says, and it goes to destruction. Okay. Now, so that's the description. So we've seen the description of the beast all around. We've seen the description of and an explanation of the seven heads, right? And then you have the description of the 10 horns. Starting in verse 12. So in verse 12 it says, and the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. Now again, notice the short time span that you have here. That's what you're supposed to get. That's the impression that you're supposed to get when it talks about 1 hour. Okay, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, so a short amount of time, which I think is in line with the little while that we saw before with the seventh king, right? Along with the little while that we're going to see as it relates to the dragon in chapter 20, right? And I think that, and actually, let me go on to read here, where it's so this is royal power, the royal power that they haven't received yet, and that's because all of this is future. I think that with the 10 horns, it's pointing to something future, and that future is what we're going to see at the very end when we're close to the end of the age there. So he says, and the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, that moment at the very end, together with the beast. Okay. Verse 13, these are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. Now, one thing that I thought was very interesting here, this is a thought that was in my mind, because the one thing that I thought in my mind is how this is somewhat of another one of those opposites, where we saw way back in chapter 4 with the 24 elders who had the 12 crowns, and how they fall before the throne, and they cast their crowns before the throne and before the Lamb. In that whole worshipful scene there, it's as if it's saying that an acknowledgement that all authority and everything comes from you. I know that was a long while ago, but that's kind of what we were talking about when we talked about that passage. And kind of in a similar way, I wonder if this is kind of what it's denoted here, except it's on the opposite end, having to do with the evil spiritual realm, and everything having to do with the beast. They give over their royal power to the beast, as if to say all of this authority ultimately comes from you, which in turn would come from the dragon, since the dragon is the one who gives its authority over to the beast. I don't know, just an interesting thought that I've had when I was looking over this passage. So it says, these are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. Verse 14, it says, they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is the Lord, he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. Now this is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful verse 14 here. Now it says, notice it says they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. Doesn't that language sound a little bit familiar? Here again is another one of those contrasts, or one of those opposites. Because in chapter 13, we read about the beast making war with the saints and conquering them. So the beast makes war with the saints, and along with that war, the beast conquers them. Although really in a real sense, they don't conquer them. We see that the saints are actually the victors. We've been seeing that ever since that point, and even up to this time. But we're talking about physical, oppressive persecution, martyrdom, and that sort of thing. The beast makes war with the saints and conquers them. Now, these 10 horns that are connected to the beast and have actually given their power over to the beast, notice it says they will make war on the Lamb and conquer the Lamb. Is that what it says? No. Here we see they finally met their match at the end, right? So this is something that's like they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. Not they will conquer the Lamb will conquer them. So they are the aggressors here in the end, and the Lamb swiftly and fully and finally conquers them. Now, I believe that with the 10 horns, what we're seeing here is things that are happening right there at the very end. So here's the difference that we see between the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The 7 heads is supposed to illustrate things that happen over a period of time. The 10 horns are supposed to picture things that happen at a particular time, that having that particular time being at the end. And the clue of that with the 10 horns is the fact that they make war on the Lamb. Now, I think that this whole thing of them making war on the Lamb is in line with what we've already seen as far as the gathering of the kings of the East, i.e. the kings of the whole world, in chapter 16. Remember what we saw there? Avert your attention back to chapter 16. Where it says in verse 13, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are demonic spirits performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for the battle on the great day of God the Almighty. Okay, so they're assembling for a battle against the Lord, and that battle is going to be manifest as they come against God's people. That's the way that whole thing is manifest. If you go to chapter 19, let's see, I think it's in verse 19. Yeah, in verse 19 of chapter 19, it says, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him. Who's him? Is Lord Jesus Christ, who's seen coming down out of heaven. So as I saw, it says, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. Okay. So again, that's a picture of the ending battle, the battle of Armageddon, everything that's going to happen at that time, where they're and if you read, we don't have to read the rest of the verses there, and again, we're going to go into detail of this when we get there in chapter 19. But if you read further in those verses, they're swiftly defeated, right? They're swiftly defeated, just like it says in chapter 17, where it says that the Lamb will conquer them, right? And then in chapter 20, when you have the release of the dragon, Satan, it says in verse 7 of chapter 20 and following, it says, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, along, as chapter 17 says, with the beast also as well. But that I just put the expositional brackets around that. But it says, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. See, this is gathering for the war. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And then in verse 10, it talks about the defeat of the devil and the dragon and that sort of thing. So there you see a gathering of war and then a swift, destruction, a defeat. The Lamb defeats them. So you see that in chapter 20, you saw it there in chapter 19, and here we're seeing it forecast here in chapter 17, where it says that that they will make war with the Lamb. And again, it's the same war against the Lamb that I think you see described in chapter 16, chapter 19, and chapter 20. And the Lamb will conquer them, okay? Just as we saw in chapter 19 and chapter 20. Okay? So there with the 10 horns, let me repeat. With the 10 horns, what you're seeing is things having to do with a particular moment in time, which would be, for our purposes in our discussion here, the end. The 7 heads are describing things throughout a period of time, which would be human history between the first and second comings of Christ, leading up to the end. And I think that's what you're dealing with there, and that's the difference you see between the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Okay, so the Lamb conquers them, and it says there's in the middle of verse 14, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, which, by the way, that's brought up again in chapter 19 in the context of that battle. Okay. So he's Lord of lords and King of kings. And let's consider that for a little bit. He's Lord of lords and King of kings. Listen, as it relates to, the expressions of the beast, manifestations of the beast, whatever that might look like right now, it can look pretty heavy duty. It looks pretty heavy duty, for different people in different parts of the world and in different parts of human history. But make no mistake, and I'm not saying anything new here. I'm not saying anything new. That God is in control, and even with ruthless, despotic people. Even with things going on today, people might easily throw out Vladimir Putin's name, and you might have other people, current or past, who you might think these are manifestations of the beast, whatever the case may be. They are not in and of themselves of their own authority. Jesus Christ himself is King of kings and Lord of lords, and when you have these other kings, the kings of the whole world, remember, and kings over all the earth, according to chapter 19. Coming up against the Lord's people in that, like I said, what I've called it, the ultimate climax, there and where they're going to be swiftly defeated, we see who really rules, who has been ruling all along. And even what we're going to talk about next time is God's sovereignty in the midst of all of this. Now, we won't talk much about that now. We'll talk about that next time. But there you see that there. So that designation, he's Lord of lords. He's Lord over all the other lords. And he's king over all the other kings. So they only dance to his tune, ladies and gentlemen. So these people are defeated because for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. Last part of verse 14, and those with him, that's you and me, if you're in Christ, are called and chosen and faithful. Okay? We are called in the sense that, the gospel has reached us. God called us out of our sinfulness. He called us to repentance. We have repented and repented and turned to Christ, and we've entered into right relationship and fellowship with him. We are chosen. Now, I know that a lot of people don't like to think about that whole thing. That gets into that whole election thing, which people are so offended by. And that, to be honest, that grieves me. That grieves me that people are very hostile and aggressive and offended by something like election. I don't have time to go into all of this. I remember I talked about election for a couple of episodes way, 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 way back. It's been a few years ago, probably 4 or so years ago, where I did the best that I can to kind of lay out the whole case for election and everything like that, and what our proper perspective should be based on what Scripture actually says about that. We won't go into that here because that's not the main focus of the passage here. But you do have a sense where it says that, again, if you go back to the description of the book of life, remember it says, and the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. What does that tell you? That tells you that the names that are written in the Lamb's book of life have been from the foundation of the world. In other words, since this whole thing began, before you and I were even here, So what does that tell you? That seems to indicate some sort of election sort of thing, some sort of choosing as it relates to all of this. Now, I realize that just by hearing that, some people get, maybe you're one of those people, or your temperature is starting to rise a little bit. I would just challenge you and ask you, if that's the case for you right now, is the reason why you deny election and deny the fact that the Bible says that he chooses people to salvation, even though it directly says that it does, is your denial of that purely emotional instead of textual? I don't know. I can't get into your head or your heart or anything like that, but I would ask you to just prayerfully consider that and do your own explanation of Scripture and let the Holy Spirit lead and guide as it relates to that. But there you even see the whole thing of the fact that we're chosen, and even what we saw before in verse 8, about the book of life from the foundation of the world, and as the last description there of us, God's people there, and faithful. And that certainly is the case, and especially when we take our minds back to chapter 13, when we're talking about the mark of the beast. We are ones who are described as people who didn't receive the mark. We didn't get that mark. We're not going to get that mark. The dwellers of the earth are. They marvel at the beast, and they get the mark of the beast. Remember, the mark of the beast is not a tattoo or a barcode or anything like that. Nothing along those lines. Okay, but I mean, again, it's falling in line with the anti-Christian, anti-God sort of sentiments, understandings, beliefs, and that sort of thing that also expresses itself in the way that one lives. And we certainly see that expressed and laid out in the book of Revelation as well. Okay. When you see this whole thing of those who haven't received the mark and therefore they're persecuted for it, I mean, really, that's the sense that you get. What have we been seeing throughout this whole time? The oppression of the saints. Now, those people who have received the mark, they are set up for destruction, right? But those of us who are faithful, who haven't received the mark, are not set for judgment because we belong to him. We have another mark. We have again, this goes into chapter 14, where we have the name of the Lamb and the name of our God written on our foreheads. Again, symbolically, not literally. But again, that shows who we belong to. And because of that, destruction, wrath is not for us. So when it comes to chapter 17 here, in chapter 17 and verse 14, those with him, again, that's you and me, aren't of that number who are conquered. Because again, it says we are called and chosen and faithful. Faithful having to do with being connected to Jesus Christ and not letting go. We are ones who do not receive that mark like everybody else does. And that's the whole thing. Okay. So last time and this time, okay, again, we're talking about the prostitute and the beast. We've pretty much all of our time has been spent on the beast, because that's what the angel who's talking to John is. That's who he's describing. But now we're going to see how the beast and the prostitute, kind of connect again, and what this whole thing that the angel is trying to describe to John as it relates to the prostitute, whom John has looked at and has marveled greatly at. And remember the angel saying, everything's not as it seems. So he describes the beast and the ugliness of the beast and his sure destruction. And now we're going to see how, what the fate of the prostitute is. Okay. And so we're going to get into that next time when we finish up chapter 17. Okay. So I hope I was able to explain that adequately enough. It's there's a lot there, and like I said, we're drawing from certain areas and certain passages that we're going to look at, and it's going to require a lot more explanation of certain things. So I'm hoping that there isn't too much confusion, just based on what we see in those future passages and what I've tried to describe now. If there is, do not let your heart be troubled, because we are going to explain those things when we get to chapter 20 in greater detail. But for now, let's just remember, though, and this is something I think that all of us can agree on, whether you're premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, futurist, preterist, whatever the case may be. Jesus Christ is going to win. We've seen it right here. And we belong to him, and we share in that victory, and we will not suffer defeat of any kind. God's enemies, Christ's enemies, those people who have come against us and who refuse to repent, they are the ones whose doom is ultimately going to be seen here. Their destruction, the king's destruction, the beast, and as we're going to see next time, the defeat of the prostitute. And we'll get into that. We'll get into that next time. But also just remember just what we said, in the last couple minutes. God is in charge. You look at any sort of political leader, governmental leader who's, who are bad actors on the historical stage. They have to answer to somebody as well. They answer to one who is ruling right now. And believe me, and we're going to talk about this a little bit next time too, we're dealing with a God who's in control, which that might be a comfort to some of you, maybe not so much, because you might think, okay, well, if that's the case, then how can we see all this chaos and this mess that we're seeing right now? Legitimate questions, I guess, but I mean, we'll talk about these sorts of things and a little bit as we talk about the last part of chapter 17 there. So, but anyway, God's in charge. And we can fully trust him because he's working everything out to its ultimate end and also for his glory. And isn't that what we really want? Isn't that what we really want? I think so. So we will leave it there for now. We will finish up chapter 17 next time. Okay. If you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, Spotify. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. Also, don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Again, as always, I will leave a link to the Amazon page in the episode description so that you can click on it and order it from there if you so choose. All right. Well, a lot of good, interesting things. At least I hope you find it interesting and encouraging as well. Because again, the theme is in all of this that we are on the winning side and that Jesus Christ wins in the end. And we've seen that repeatedly a few times, even in this passage that we're looking at here. So I hope this has been interesting for you, but more than that, I hope it's encouraging for you as well. And we'll continue on with that encouragement when we finish up chapter 17 as well. Okay? Well, my name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.